Part of Igor Stravinsky's ballet The Firebird, the Orchestre de Paris was conducted by our guest today, Klaus Mäkelä, on that brand new Decca recording. Hello, I'm James Jolly and welcome to this Gramophone podcast given in association with Wigmore Hall, which over the next week sees visits by Gramophone Award winners Marianne Krebassa, Beatrice Rana, Stephen Isserlis, the Dunedin Consort and the Nash Ensemble. Klaus Mäkelä has just released an album of two Stravinsky ballets, The Firebird and The Rite of Spring, featuring the Orchestre de Paris for Decca. I caught up with Klaus in Ohio by Zoom.
So you're in Cleveland. Is this your debut with the orchestra there?
No, I've been here a few times, and this is one of my absolute favorite orchestras in the world. I came here for the first time. It was just, they have a summer festival at Blossom, 2018 or 19. And we had a really, really nice chemistry. And then I started coming back here, and now I'm here sort of every year. It feels so wonderful to be here. The musicians are so sensitive, and the orchestra has such culture. Everyone knows exactly where to watch in which transition and who to follow and where in the bow to play. And it's really, really wonderful.
I was going to ask you, and I think you might have just answered my question was, is the orchestra actually, when you're up close and personal, everything that, one kind of expects from the Cleveland Orchestra? Because, it's one of the very few American orchestras that just has this incredible tradition that you can sort of trace back to George Sell. And it still sounds like the Cleveland Orchestra whenever I hear it.
It's crazy because it does. And it's actually, sometimes it feels it's even more. Because, as a conductor, we're so depending on the orchestras at the end. And if we have a good orchestra in our hands, we become much better conductors because then we have much more possibilities and opportunities to really find the expression and the color and the agogic. And with this band, it's really crazy because they have such a strong orchestra culture that they know exactly how to do things together. And then when that's being taken care of, it's a chamber group which you just sort of, you guide them a little bit. And that's so freeing, musically, because you don't have to beat time. It's not about that. And, I've always loved historical recordings, and I listen to all the old George Sell and many other, of course, also the Dovnani Decca era and so on. And it's wonderful. And it's really managed to keep that sound.
So you got a concert tonight, or is it...
We actually, for some weird reason, there is no concert now on Friday. We had yesterday Mahler 5 and a piece by Usuk Chin. And tomorrow we have one more. Then I go to Chicago. And now it's interesting because I do Mahler 5 2 weeks in a row. So first here and then in Chicago. And it's really interesting because it's a piece which is so part of both of the orchestra's, spirit and DNA. So the difference, very interesting to see.
I was thinking of a sort of analogy for what it must be like for you at the moment. It must be like sort of going around the world's great restaurants and seeing whether, whether the kind of reputation of the chef is sort of as you would imagine. Because, to go from Cleveland to Chicago is kind of, you're talking 3 Michelin stars both times.
It's true. That's a very funny thing, but it's true. But it's very interesting because in a way, I think, especially with this piece, the very sort of true qualities and tendencies of the orchestras come very strongly present. And I enjoyed, yesterday, last night, because the Cleveland Orchestra is a very dynamic orchestra. I think it was in some ways, of course, it's a very strong piece, Mahler 5, but it was the softest Mahler 5 I ever did, and I loved it, Of course, it had the climax, which it needs to be, as it always comes out, because it's so strongly written and played. But it was so many parts were really, really soft, like super pianissimo. And I thought to myself, why haven't I realized this before? It gives a completely different sort of idea when it's truly, and the best thing is here, I don't even have to speak. I just show and do like this, and they play super, super, super soft. It's really interesting, and I'm like a sound tourist. I always take something with me, so I try to remember. Okay, this is how they sounded in this part. I want to remember that, and so I try to bring it somewhere next time.
Well, let's talk about one of your two orchestras, the Orchestre de Paris and the Stravinsky album, which is just out. It's a much younger orchestra, founded in the late 60s, 67. Does that have a sense of tradition, do you think? Is there a sort of French tradition that you feel? Because, these two particular Stravinsky scores, the Rite of Spring and the Firebird, were, of course, premiered in Paris. So, it's part of the sort of French orchestral culture.
Yes, and absolutely. This orchestra, even if it's quite young, in many ways, it continued the tradition of the older French orchestras, premiering Symphony, Fantastique, and so on. It's a wonderful orchestra because it's so strongly characterized by the French school of playing. And it has to do with the fact that people are either French or then French trained. So it's a very specific way of playing. And of course, in some instruments, even more than others. So if we think about the French woodwind, for example, it's so wonderful. It has this lightness, brightness, expression, and the musical freedom, which is the most amazing thing one can ask for a musician. It is to have this imagination of just and being free. It's a wonderful band. It's interesting because of its history. It has had a lot of music directors. So in a way, it's been influenced by lots of different kind of styles, lots of different approaches. And its core repertoire is French, and especially Stravinsky, but also Germanic music. So they have this a little bit sort of, for a French orchestra, a tiny bit perhaps deeper, a tiny bit darker sonority. But with this Stravinsky, it was so wonderful because we had Firebird and Sacre. And Firebird, of course, everyone played the suites many times, but not the ballet often, because we played the complete ballet, which I love because it has a completely different narrative. And once you do that, it's impossible to go back to the suite. That they didn't play so much, so it was in a way a sense of discovery in something very familiar. But then the Rite of Spring, it's really their piece, and they own it, and they feel that this is really our music. And that was so wonderful to do because, from the very first moment on Monday morning when we started at 10, one could feel that, okay, these people really know their stuff. But it's wonderful. It's great to do that music with them especially.
Kind of sense it when the Rite of Spring starts with the bassoon solo. All of a sudden you just think, oh God, that's the kind of sound. I don't know. I was really, literally, as you say, from the first second, you sort of feel it's so right. And particularly with such a spectacular recording. These really are absolutely stunningly recorded performances.
Thank you. You're so sweet. And we were so lucky to get to do it at the Philharmonie de Paris because it really makes a difference to record in that hall. It's a wonderful hall also to listen to concerts, and we rehearse there. Every rehearsal is there, every concert is there, so we're very, very lucky. But to record there was so special because you could really you could get this transparency, but also the blend of sound. And especially for Stravinsky, for both these pieces which have a lot of different texture happening at the same time, it's possible to also tell apart different textures, which I really, really like. And we had a great team, Jörn Pedersen and Arne Axelberg. People I trust very much, and we worked a lot together. So it felt like a really nice project to do together.
You've taken the two outer wings of this sort of Diaghilev triptych. You've got the Firebird and the Rite of Spring, although you actually put them the other way around on your album. But it's amazing to think, the difference in time between the two works is, relatively small, something like 3 years. But actually, the difference between the two pieces, it could be sort of 15 years. It's such an astounding leap between Firebird and the Rite of Spring in the language he uses and the sonorities and the timbre of the orchestra.
You're absolutely right. For me, the Firebird is really the last great late romantic work. And it still bears that spirit of the late romantic, with all the expression in the gestures. But also, of course, the harmonic development is on. And then you really feel that he wants to break loose, break free from that sort of, the tension of tonality and the limits of that. But it still carries the spirit of something uplifted, something very passionate, something quite impulsive. And for me, it's a masterwork, the Firebird. I've always loved it. And of course, then we have Sacre, which is so obviously a completely different language. And it's so funny about the Rite of Spring is that at the end, if you look at the score, so many of the motives from which this piece is built up, they are very, very, very simple and very condensed. And it almost reminds me of, in some ways, Beethoven, in a sense that you have some very clear short motives, which are then kind of molded and forged and repeated, and then through this tension, it creates something new and something different. But I must say that the instrumentation of the Rite of Spring is just beyond. The combinations and how to imagine such sounds back in 1913 is really a miracle.
I assume that for a conductor, the one sort of quality that they have to convey in a performance of the Rite of Spring is shock, because that's what you take away from a really good performance of the Rite of Spring. It's kind of shocking. I mean, not just the story is shocking, but just the whole primeval connection with, the sort of the soil. Too often these days it's used as a virtuoso showpiece, look what I as conductor can do, look what my orchestra can do. But actually that's kind of missing the point. And you've got to leave the audience stunned at the end of it.
And it's a wonderful piece because it really, as you said, it is to shock and it is to be very disturbing at the same time. And some of the moments for me, which are the finest in that piece, are actually always those very quiet, calm moments just before the outbursts. If you think about, for example, the second last movement, just before the sacrificial dance, with this kind of suspense and just boom, 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 this bass drum and then alto flute and bass trumpet and these kind of colors and sounds, and then really holding the tension, and then it breaks out completely. It needs to be shocking, and it needs to be both harmonically shocking, but especially it has to have the rhythmic drive, I think, above all. Again, so different from Firebird, which is such a different piece to pace because it has a strong narrative. And Rite of Spring at the end, it doesn't really have a story. Of course, we know what happens in each movement and what's the background of it, but it doesn't really follow such a narrative. It's different pictures which are masterfully put together. But Firebird is so different because every little gesture in music is also a gesture on stage for the ballet, or a gesture of some sort. And it's never notes, but it's always a group of something. And that I found so fascinating about it. And it's also quite a lot longer than the Rite of Spring. So to pace it right, well, one always must make sure that you have enough energy for the orchestra until the end, because so many of these quite tricky things happen in the first half of the piece, which don't sound so complicated, but they need the absolute precision and kind of very delicate characterization. But then when you need the power is at the end, and then the orchestra still needs to have the focus and the concentration towards that.
You said earlier on that, you're a great fan of listening to old recordings, as I'm sure we all are, many of us are. With a work like the Rite of Spring, you can go back to Pierre Monteux, so you can actually go back to, as it were, ground zero, the guy who conducted the premiere. And then, of course, you've got the composer's own interpretation. I mean, how do you balance, the research aspect, as it were, of listening to old recordings with the kind of just, I'm an audience member, I'm listening to this recording as a music lover, and then as a conductor having to say, okay, I've listened to Mahler, I've listened to Stravinsky, I've listened to such and such conductor that Stravinsky admired, I've listened to the tradition, now I put it to one side and make up my own mind, as it were, or, it's me and the score and the orchestra. Is there a sort of process you go through?
One needs to be very careful, because if one listens too much to recordings, then you start imagining that those ideas, what you suddenly get while you read the score, are yours, but they're not yours, they're from someone else. But then also one needs to do research, and as you said, with Stravinsky, it's so amazing that we, first of all, have recordings of these pieces conducted by himself. If you think about it, it's in the same league as we would say that we have a Beethoven Eroica conducted by Beethoven. It's crazy to think that we actually have that. Of course, one always has to take everything within a context, and we know that Stravinsky maybe couldn't, through his own conducting and those recordings, he couldn't express absolutely maybe what he thought. Especially, he was also a completely different man by the time he recorded those pieces than when he was, young and completely different in spirit. I still find especially the discography for both these pieces, especially Rite of Spring, very, very fascinating because there are so many different approaches, and in a way you can also hear the development of orchestra culture, from the very early recordings, which really seemed that the orchestras and conductors were fighting against this opponent, which is the piece. And now it has become this piece which really people feel super comfortable in. And then it is to, of course, be shocking and not too easygoing, not too relaxed. But when I study the pieces with these especially, the scores are so strong, and they are so stimulating to study, because there is so much of detail, and in so much of different detail in both of the pieces, that the Rite of Spring is filled with this kind of wonderful blends in a different combination of instruments, which you really wouldn't think of. Firebird, on the other hand, has a lot of interesting corners which have a little sparkle of this and little sparkle of that, and to find the ideal balance between those is always very challenging. But I love studying both of them because they're both is two completely different journeys, and one is just very, very stimulated by the fact that what you read and what you see. And even if you think about the score of Rite of Spring, for example, it is an artwork as it is when you look at it. If you look at some of the pages, it's so extremely beautiful and impressive.
He was famed for the precision of his scores, and you see all those pictures of him, with his different coloured pencils, beautifully lined out, and all kind of absolutely like sort of soldiers. It is extraordinary with a word like the Rite of Spring, where, as you say, those incredible combinations of sonorities, that it almost seemed to just go straight from his head onto the paper. He didn't seem to be a great reviser. It more or less came to him and down it went. Beautifully, as you say.
It seemed like that. And then only later he did a few revisions to make it sort of clearer to play and conduct. So those were basically the revisions he did. With the Firebird is very interesting because, of course, we have the original ballet music, which is scored for this massive orchestra with even offstage brass, which is used very, very sparingly, but it's great. Then he did the two different suites, the 1919 and 1945. And that's, of course, a challenge because he completely reorchestrated them and he really revisited them, almost like Sibelius did with his Fifth Symphony. I had the patience to really rewrite them proper and not only just, cut the free length. But he also changed quite a lot of articulation and in a way wanted to sharpen the idea of certain phrases, certain gestures. And then the question is how much we take those in the original version, which in a way at the end is a different animal. And I think it's important to treat the original score as this, for me, a little bit impressionistic, but especially very romantic way. Because if you see, especially the last suite he did, 1945, he wants to add more and more accents. In other words, he wanted clarity, and especially the older he got, everything he wanted sharper. And also, if you listen to the recording, it's relatively dry in expression. Everything is added accents, sharper, shorter, more compact. And then when you see the original score, it's quite lush and it's quite soft in some ways, even if it's very strong. So there you have to make a really clear decision.
Piece has actually changed genre because as a ballet, it was a partnership with the dancers. But actually, as the suites, there's no way they could be danced. I mean, that wasn't the idea at all. This was, an extraction from the ballet. So in a way, they were there, I guess, to serve a different purpose. So maybe, without the dancers there to kind of convey stuff, he felt that he had to, as it were, as you say, sharpen the orchestral writing up to make more impact in a concert hall setting.
I think it's a very interesting thought. Yeah, I absolutely agree. That's very well said. Yeah, absolutely. But it's so interesting also to look at this, Stravinsky's, especially those early masterworks, through the context in the Ballet Russe, with Diaghilev taking a massive risk in asking Stravinsky to write Firebird. In some ways, he was completely unexperienced, and suddenly he writes this massive orchestra masterpiece. And then, of course, also with in partnership with the great Nijinsky, which for sure inspired a lot of Stravinsky's writing, and then this certain, heroic, very virtuosic approach of especially the Firebird.
I remember when the new century turned, and I was thinking in Gramophone, should we do something about, what was the greatest work of the 20th century? And, we decided to go down a different route. But actually, my colleagues and I think Diapason in France did exactly the same. So I was fascinated, and it was amazing how many of the critics said, without hesitation, Rite of Spring has to be the watershed of music in the 20th century, because it's almost like sort of music before the Rite of Spring and after the Rite of Spring. And I know that doesn't take in necessarily into the breakdown of tonality, but in a way that's a little bit later, just a little bit later. But I mean, every time I hear Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, I just think, this has to be one of the tiny handful of just staggering works of the last century.
I feel the same. For me, it's the rhythmic drive, which is something like never before. As I said, maybe the closest is in some ways Beethoven, which comes in this manic intensity in the rhythm and insisting, repeating. But then also actually even maybe the rhythm is even more prominent in the sacred than the harmony. But also harmony there are some really interesting moments harmonically, which are completely different from anything else written before. And even if you think about the very beginning of the second part, the sacrifice, where you have this chord, which is, you have a D minor in the horn, and then in the oboe, A. And then you have something completely different. You have this kind of bitonal feeling is really haunting. And then these chords almost like a cloud of pollution just going at you. It's also harmonically very interesting and very, very developed.
I think you realise actually how many film composers later on, must have studied the Rite of Spring just for the sort of sonorities and the combination of sounds, because you can sort of close your eyes in parts of the Rite of Spring and you get images that you've heard in movies and you just think, gosh, that's such a Rite of Spring sound, because it's like nothing else, just these weird combinations of sort of high winds and, it's just extraordinary, really extraordinary. So, I guess the question is, you've got these two panels. You've got Rite of Spring, Firebird, and the central panel. Is Petrushka in your sights as well?
It is. That's going to follow up next. So next album we'll have Debussy Jeu, then Petrushka, and then the prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun. So then we paired with something a little bit different. And Debussy Jeu, of course, is very interesting because that was premiered weeks away from the Sacre, which is really, really interesting. And of course, having the same complexity, but in a completely different outfit and completely different character. And that's, for me, one of the greatest pieces in the world is Debussy Jeu. But that's a little riddle, and it's a puzzle. And it's really the complexity of that. When you study it's so extremely stimulating. And how to communicate that to the public and to the orchestra is a real challenge, because it's so delicate and everything is so intelligent and perfectly crafted, but it doesn't have any of this kind of roughness, which in a way can help camouflage a little bit of those edges. But it needs to be really perfect. It's a little bit like a Mozart symphony, which really has to be perfect in order to be effective.
Looking forward to the actual release of this first album, which I've been enjoying enormously. But look forward to this, what I hope might turn into a Diaghilev-inspired series, which would be lovely.
Part of the Rite of Spring, the Orchestre de Paris was conducted by its music director Klaus Mäkelä on that brand new Decca release. Gramophone Podcasts are given in association with Wigmore Hall, and here are the concerts for the next 7 days. On Friday, March the 24th at 7:30, Gramophone Award winner, the mezzo Marianne Krebassa, joined by Joseph Middleton at the piano, sings a programme of French and Spanish songs, including cycles by Jesus Guridi, Debussy and Ravel. Saturday lunchtime at 1 o'clock, pianist Lucy Parham, joined by the actor Henry Goodman, gives another of her composer-focused performances, celebrating Rachmaninoff in this, his 150th birthday year. That evening at 7:30, pianist Imogen Cooper gives a programme of Liszt, Schubert and Beethoven, including his 2 final piano sonatas. Sunday morning at 11:30, the Marmon Quartet play Mozart's E-flat Quartet, K428, and Janáček's Second Intimate Letters. Then in the evening at 7:30, mandolin player Avi Avital and accordionist Ksenia Sidorova pair up for a programme of arrangements ranging from the 18th to the 20th centuries, visiting France, Austria, Italy, Spain, Romania and Brazil along the way. Monday lunchtime, March the 27th, and live-streamed finds Stephen Isserlis cello, Yonian Ilias Kadesha, Irene Duval, violins, Ivan Ringstad, viola, Vashti Hunter cello, Lucy Shaw double bass, and Maggie Cole harpsichord playing Boccherini. On Monday evening at 7:30, violinist Simone Lamsma and pianist Beatrice Rana play sonatas by Brahms, Prokofiev, his first, and Respighi, as well as 3 preludes by Lera Auerbach. On Tuesday, March the 28th at 5 o'clock, the Nash Ensemble's Adrian Brendel, cello, and Alistair Beatson, piano, and horn player Johan Stone from the Royal Academy of Music play music by Colin Matthews, Andrea Balancy-Béarn, Eleanor Alberga, Sun Keating, and Hans Abrahamsen. Then it's Katie Hamilton will be in conversation with some of the composers appearing in the concert by the Nash Ensemble, directed by Martin Brabbins, at 7:30. Colin Matthews, George Benjamin, John Caskin, Julian Anderson and Mark Anthony Turnage, which will also feature the soprano Claire Bluth and tenor Mark Padmore. It's the ensemble's annual Nash Inventions concert. On Wednesday evening at 7:30, the Van Cuyk Quartet plays Mozart's Hunt Quartet, Debussy's and Mendelssohn's F minor Quartet, Opus 80. On Thursday, March the 30th at 11:30 and 1 p.m. are 2 children's concerts with the Cayenne Quartet and presenter Lucy Drever. And in the evening at 7:30, the Dunedin Consort, directed by Benjamin Bale, with the soprano Nardis Williams, present Handel in Rome. On Friday, March the 31st at 7:30, cellist Anastasia Kobakina with Jean-Selim Abdelmoula piano play Brahms's 2 sonatas, Schumann's Fantasiestücke and the Adagio and Allegro in A-flat. Full details and tickets at wigmore-hall.org.uk, where you can also find details of Gramophone's centenary concert on May the 14th, with performances by pianists Jean-F. Lambavuzet, Bertrand Chamayou, Cédric Tiberghien and Martin James Bartlett, violinist Alina Ibrahimova, guitarists Sean Shiba and Milosh, and singers Karin Sampson, Fatma Saeed, Emma Sventilius and Karim Suleiman, with accompanists Joseph Middleton and Malcolm Martineau. And tickets for Wigmore Hall concerts between April and July are on sale now. wigmore-hall.org.uk. Gramophone podcasts are free, but if you enjoy them, then a really great way to support our work is to take out a subscription to Gramophone magazine. Over 13 issues a year, we bring you hundreds of reviews by our expert critics, as well as in-depth articles about the latest classical music releases and the most exciting musicians of the day. And if you head over to gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and enter the code podcast20 in the checkout, you can even get a 20% discount off any subscription package. We really value your support. And consider leaving a review or rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. And do look out for another Gramophone podcast very soon.